Hi, thanks for having me.
Gladly. I want to start with the Beachcombers, as you might have guessed. Your main character, Bernice, her story is deeply affected by this show, which I thought was funny and also really poignant. Why Beachcombers for you?
For many of us who grew up in a certain era in a certain place, northern Saskatchewan, northern Alberta, northern BC, you got two TV channels, and CBC was one of them. Beachcombers was a huge part of that. And on the Beachcombers at the time, I was thinking about, I'm sure there were some younger cousins on there too. But for me, it was always about Jessie. And when you turned in as a young Cree girl to see somebody on TV at night who looked like you, who kind of sounded like you, it was a big thing. He also had a sister on the show too. There's another, not Pat John, but Jim was the last name. And to see yourself reflected within that was a big deal. In the same way that when we turned on Sesame Street, I remember seeing Buffy St. Marie, like those few periods of time where you would see somebody who you would call a cousin or you would think of as a cousin. But the other thing that I think was, I think I put within the book, or if you look at Google, it'll say that Bernice goes looking for a healthy, working, independent man, Indian man. And that's true, but every person has a list. And on her list, those things were key. And she got to see that in the media. So I think that that's part of it. And the other part was that there is this group of people who you would look at and think they don't have a lot in common. They don't necessarily know each other, but when they start out, but they treat each other good. And they become an adoptive family of sorts. They make something there. And I think that maybe in the end, that was something that really appealed to me too, that you might not be seeing the entire family there, but you're seeing the family people chose.
I think it was the issue of representation that I thought was so poignant about Beachcombers. You know, also growing up with few representations of people like myself on television, you know, I see how we gravitate towards these people. The media affects our imagination hugely and can affect our stories so deeply, more so than we really recognize. And I saw that in Bernice.
Yeah, I think it's not just the healthy working Indian man. It's the possibility that that person is out there. There's a healthy father figure someplace. And I
The
think
whole scope of our imagination. Yeah.
that whole piece of it was there for her to access someplace.
You use a lot of humor in your story as well. I want to get into specifically how you use it, but first, why did you feel like humor belonged in this story of tragedy?
If we just beckon back to the Beachcombers, if you have to choose a man as a potential mate or somebody you would follow, there is humor in not choosing Nicodonas or Relic. But there's also, I think one of the elders that I've talked to along the way said it best, where some of the most awful stories that we have and the stories that teach us laws, really firm laws as Cree peoples about how to live your life in a way that is graceful and respectful and without shame. That some of those stories are hard. They're told in the darkest part of winter. But you don't just tell a hard story. You have to be able to introduce it in ways that are meaningful. So the humor itself is really important to be able to get people to listen and to universalize the experience, because we don't all universalize everything negative. We don't universalize everything positive. So for me, it comes from two places. The first is that you just have to be able to bring people to it, knowing that there is an audience that will listen to each bit. But also that even if there is horror, there is terror, is there the big awful, as I call it. If the big awful has happened, there's also the big wonderful. And you have to remain cognizant that there's a flip side and there's always that other piece there. So that's part of it. And the other thing is, I come from a family where my sister would say things to me like, introducing me to a crowd, say, "This is my sister Tracey. She's really funny. Say something funny." So I would be on the spot to have to be able to produce it. So I'm shocked when I do readings where people actually laugh, because when I bring family, they laugh at certain points, and then non-Indigenous community members will laugh at other points. So it's interesting to me, because I think coming from a Cree father and a Swedish father and a Cree mother, that's in there for everybody, but not necessarily converging at the same point.
How do the two cultural senses of humor differ? What's a way that you've noticed?
I think
that's interesting to me.
It's hard. And I often said to people for years, I'm not funny to my Cree relatives. It was really distressing. They don't think I'm funny. But there's a lot of double entendre in Cree, where on the surface there's something really sort of poignant, gentle humor, and underneath there's something that can be lascivious or seedy. So you have to be able to play with words a lot. And I found that in my Cree family, playing with language and playing with words and absurdity is huge there. And then the stuff on my Swedish side of the family is just regular old entitled, we think we are the humorous in the world stuff.
There's a prevailing stereotype that Indigenous people are stoic, and that sense of humor that you just described is not part of the prevailing stereotype. Why do you think that is?
I think that it can come from a number of places. And the first is a well-situated place, I think, where people have a respectful relationship and they want to be able to observe and understand Indigenous peoples without the buffoonery that was introduced in the 40s, 50s, 60s imagery of Indigenous people. I think that part of it is grounded in a place of potentially less well-intended, or as well-intended but less operatively, it's a little more damaging, where people want that stoicism to be present because it can belie the fact of the damage that has taken place as a result of colonial settlement. And if you have the stoic Indian imagery there, then we couldn't have done anything too bad. And I think that part of it is that there is a genuine part of us as Indigenous peoples when we show up in situations and places where we're not sure about the environment, that we do tend to stay quiet and watch. So,
of course, that's a human tendency, of course, yeah.
It's one of those stereotypes with its grain of truth in a little tiny place. So it's a possibility that we observe a lot when we get to a place where we don't know what the environment's like.
Also on the topic of humor, in your book, there's a particular instance where a white character stutters when she's asking anybody want a brownie because she's afraid of offending. What were you trying to get at there about communication? Well,
for her personally, Lola, she comes from a place where she initially has an item on her menu that is pejoratively titled. It's a square that's named after a racialized term for Indigenous women. And she gets to the point where she's actually checking herself, brownie. She doesn't know it. And part of it is that, you know, she's traveled a long way to get from that privileged position where she can call anybody and anything, whatever she wants, to the point where she has to actually sit back and check her entitlement. So that's part of it. And the other part of it is that she understands, by virtue of having had a conversation with Indigenous peoples and having Indigenous peoples living under her roof, that things within her have fundamentally changed and that she does not have the right not to know anymore, that she takes it on. But the humor is a nice way to say, yeah, just talk to us and you'll find out what's okay. And also, some things you do are going to be embarrassing and uncomfortable and really funny.
What do you think doesn't get asked or doesn't happen when people don't have these conversations, when they're too afraid of saying the wrong thing and causing offense?
Well, that's interesting. I've been co-teaching a class to seniors for part of the summer, an hour a day, everybody over 65. And they're non-Indigenous seniors. So typical Canadian crowd, I suppose. Not my typical Canadian crowd, but a typical Canadian crowd. And I said to them at the very beginning, the process that we're going to operate and the principle that we're going to underwrite here is that everybody gets to make kind mistakes. As long as you do your research, you go back out and you think about it and have done what you can to find out as much information, then show up and ask the question. And if you're still not comfortable, write them down. And so they would write the questions down. So I actually know the questions that people are afraid to ask. And they include things like, what's the deal with taxation? Why is it that Indigenous women are harmed and missing in such great numbers? Is there such a thing as a free education? What sort of violence happens between communities? People weren't asking those questions before about lateral violence, which I think is really interesting. People at that age who have never had a class talking about Indigenous peoples ever before are starting to ask the questions, and I think that's huge. They're also wondering about Indigenous laws. What does Indigenous government look like without the Indian Act? Like, what does a real inherent government look like? What do those laws actually contain that live within you, not by virtue of the Canadian state? And that's a big deal, to be 75 years old and to have your first interaction and have wondered that for years and to be able to ask it.
How long have you been teaching that class?
This is the first time.
Wow.
Yeah, first time through a a lifelong learning class, and they go an hour every day. They take aside 4 classes and study 4 different areas they've never studied before.
Well, in terms of broaching difficult subjects, you definitely do that with this book. You face, the main character faces trauma, domestic abuse, things that you've encountered and experienced in your life. What made you want to face those things with this novel?
I think that when I started it writing it as a love letter to women and saying that you can love yourself regardless of the violence that enters your life. You can have beauty regardless of no choices, the choices you made, one bad choice, excellent choices. This could happen, but that you can find the place where you can be happiest and healthiest. And I think that I started out writing it for people outside of that. And I always say to people, I don't care if you read it, put it in a library where somebody who needs it will be able to get access to it. But along the way, it became a love letter for myself, where I had to realize when I was writing some of the particularly difficult scenes, it would be wrenching, the things that it would pull out of me, and I'd be unable to write for days because I was so shaken up. And not because it was graphic or not because it was triggering, but because it addressed it in a way that I had never addressed violence before, sexual violence before. And as a person who has gone to therapy, given lectures on it, spoken of it, I'm an advocate for whatever it takes for you to get through it. Maybe that's a novel. Maybe it's a record. Whatever it takes for you to be able to give it verse, give it flight in a healthy way, then you do that. And that's eventually what it became for me, was a place where I could put all of that and thankfully put it in a place where it could help other people, because writing itself can become a very selfish act. It's only selfless when it perpetuates and gives gifts to other people, and I hope that's what it does.
When you put it out into the world and share it.
Yeah. And it was a tremendously long process. And I would say to people, if you have that one story that you have to get out, then do it. But also that it takes exactly the amount of time it's supposed to take. This wouldn't be the story that it took in 2 years. It had to be a story that took that long.
Well, it's a beautiful story, and a beautiful story about female friendship
Yeah.
as well. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.